Okay, everybody, thank you for coming today. It is my absolute pleasure, honor, and privilege to introduce Dr. Mark Leary as our speaker today. Dr. Leary was my PhD advisor and mentor at Duke University, where he just retired from last year. Dr. Leary is a social and personality psychologist who has spent most of his career dedicated to understanding human behavior. In the world of social psychology, we think of him as famous because he's so well known and respected in the field. In fact, I could go on and on about many of the reasons why we consider him famous. For example, he has published 14 books and more than 250 scholarly articles and chapters. He is the founding editor of the journal Self and Identity. He was president of our premier organization, the Society of Personality and Social Psychology, and he has given countless talks just like this one. Given all of these achievements, he has earned every right to be a little bit proud of himself.
Oh,
However,
Jesus, there's a lot of people. Oh, can they hear me?
every right to be proud of himself, he is not proud, but rather down to earth, thoughtful, compassionate, and most importantly for today's topic, full of intellectual humility. My pleasure to introduce Dr. Leary as he presents the psychology of intellectual humility. We can't all be right. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you.
They're all on mute, so.
Thank you very much. Let me just say one thing before we get started. I have had lots of really good students over the last 40 years, and Ashley knows I'll probably embarrass her with this, but she's one of the finest students I ever had. I first met her when she was an undergraduate, about the age of a lot of you, so I've known her a long time. She was did her honors project with me, and then went to Duke at the time I did and did her PhD there. You guys who know her just know she's fantastic, intelligent, and a good collaborator, and just a fine, exceptional person. So I just want to thank you for the invitation, Ashley. Also want to say hi to all the Psych-Hi people. I know that Psych-Hi, the Psychology Honorary, is sponsoring this. I was in Psych-Hi. I was Psych-Hi president of my little chapter. I went to a small liberal arts college, not a whole lot different than UNCP, but that was way back in 1975, 76, as much as I hate to admit that. So always happy to see other Psych-Hiers. But welcome to everybody, wherever you happen to be coming from. She said, I've given many talks like this. No, I haven't. I've given like one other one, virtual like this. This is very strange. I'll be actually able to see all of you, but we'll see how we'll do. So let me start sharing my screen so that you can see what I want to show you along the way. There we go. Ashley, can everybody see that?
No, not yet. I see a blank screen and probably in, oh, that's better. Thank you.
All right. All right, here we go.
Yet.
Before I get started, this was a 4-year project, and a lot of people are involved, and I got them listed there at the bottom. Rick Hoyle, my former colleague at Duke, great guy and a fantastic researcher, and a group of graduate students, not just from social and personality psychology, but from cognitive psychology as well. So anyway, thank you so much for having me, and let's have a good ride here for the next 45 minutes or so. To start out, I would like you to think about all of the disagreements that you have with other people. From minor disagreements about relatively unimportant, trivial things to major disagreements about important matters. We disagree with other people a lot. I want you to think about all those disagreements for a moment. And I want you to think about, my slide is not advancing for some reason. There we go. In what percentage of the disagreements that you have with other people do you think that you're the one who is correct? Now, we don't always know when we disagree with other people. Sometimes we find out who's correct. Somebody Googles the right answer and go, oh yeah, Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president. Okay, you're right. A lot of times we don't know. We make decisions with people to do this versus that, and we disagree. We don't know if that was the right decision or not. So we don't know, but just try to figure out, in what percentage of the disagreements that you have with other people, are you the one who's correct? Now, let's think about this. If we all knew in every disagreement whether we were right or not, if there was a big voice that came out of the sky and said, Mark, that's wrong. You're wrong this time. Or the voice comes out of the sky. Oh, that's right. Okay, you're okay. Oh, that was right too. No, this was stupid. That was wrong. If we all knew for sure, the average of all of our guesses about the percentage of times we're right ought to average out at 50%, right? If somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And if we all knew the truth and we took the average of everybody ought to say 50%. That's the correct. Not everybody should say 50%, but the average should be 50%. Some of us might be more right than others of us are, but if you average them, you ought to get 50%. Well, you can probably imagine that when I asked a large number of adult Americans this same question, they didn't average out at 50%. Here's the distribution of their answers. In fact, over 80% of them said that they were the one who was right more than 50% of the time. And you can see the distribution. We had 4% only who said that they were wrong more often than not. That can't be right. And everybody else is spread out between 50% and 100%. We had a couple percentage of people who said they were the one that was right 100% of the time. And the average was 66. That means the average person, I'm going to back up, that the average person thinks they're right 2/3 of the time. And it just can't be. Well, we've known this a long time. There's a lot of research showing that human beings are overly confident in their knowledge and in their decisions and whether they're right or wrong. But that's not exactly what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the fact that on this graph, there's a distribution. There's some people who are pretty even-handed around the 50% mark, and then people are spread out a great deal. People differ in the degree to which they think that they're mostly right. And that's fundamentally what intellectual humility is. It's the degree to which people recognize that their personal beliefs, attitudes, or positions are fallible. And what I mean by fallible is, do you recognize the possibility that what you believe might be wrong, that it's incorrect, it's invalid? And people differ on this. Some people very easily admit, well, here's what I believe, but I could be wrong. And there's other people who go through life completely certain that whatever it is that they think, whatever beliefs and attitudes they have, that in fact they're correct. That's what I want to talk about. We can talk about intellectual humility at 3 different levels of analysis. We can talk about how intellectually humble somebody is at a given moment in time. We're going to call that state intellectual humility. In a particular conversation, a particular interaction, do you recognize in that interaction that in fact what you're saying and what you believe might not be true? We can talk about domain-specific intellectual humility. Each one of us have domains, topics, in which we're willing to recognize and admit, hey, here's what I think, but I might be wrong about this. But we each also have domains or topics in which we're completely sure that we're right, whether we are or not. And we can talk about trait intellectual humility. In general, across time and different topics, on average, how intellectually humble are you? And this is what we're going to talk about most. Differences among people, something like a personality characteristic from people who are very low in intellectual humility, who think that they're right a great deal of the time, to people who are high in intellectual humility and recognize that their beliefs and attitudes or positions are fallible. So what are we going to cover? Very quickly. Oh, well, let me say first, why did we get interested in this? We got interested in this because we thought that low intellectual humility has a number of downsides. Low intellectual humility probably stimulate a lot of unnecessary arguments and conflict if you go through life thinking that you're right more than other people are. Low intellectually humble people probably, we thought, dismiss information that's contrary to their own opinions and beliefs. If you tell me something and it's contrary to what I already believe, if I'm low in intellectual humility, immediately you're wrong. You have to be, because I am unwilling to question whether my own beliefs are incorrect. We thought, and I'll come back to this in a minute, we thought that people low in intellectual humility are going to be particularly likely to derogate people who disagree with them. They just don't say, you're wrong, I disagree with you, but they devalue them, denigrate, derogate them. We thought that low intellectual humility might also lead to an unwillingness to negotiate or compromise. Why should I compromise with you if I'm right and I'm certain I'm right and there's no chance that I'm wrong? And perhaps most troubling, I think intellectual humility interferes with people's ability to correct their incorrect beliefs. If I'm right, I don't need to question whether what I think is correct or not. And so I'm going to walk around with a lot of incorrect beliefs and attitudes and be unwilling to consider them. I notice here, I'm sorry, the way I've set up here, the sun is starting to come in on me. I'm going to take 10 seconds and close that curtain right there. Just hold on 1 second.
You go right ahead. I'm going to just ponder how intellectually humble we are while you do that. We all probably think we're super intellectually humble because we're all above average. Okay, I'm muting myself again, Mark. Are you ready?
I think I'm ready, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry about that. I thought I had the lighting set up where this was not going to be a problem. There it is. So here's what I want to talk about in the next half hour or so. I want to give you a sense of the characteristics of people low and high in intellectual humility to sort of paint a personality profile of what they're like. I want to talk about some studies we did that involve how do they approach evidence when they hear things that are inconsistent with what they think. How do people low versus high in intellectual humility respond to that? How do they deal with other people who disagree with them? Or how do they deal with other people who change their minds? Because that's kind of a problem for intellectually humble people. I want to talk about its effects on close relationships. And I think what's going to happen here is there's a lot of you listening where light bulbs are going to go off in your head, because it's a problem trying to have a close relationship of any kind, friendship, romantic relationship, family relationship, with a know-it-all. And some of you already know that. And then I want to talk about some possible downsides of intellectual humility. What I'm going to talk about unfolded over about a 4-year period of research. And the first thing that we had to do to study intellectual humility is to have a measure which didn't exist at the time, at least not a valid one. We spent an entire year coming up with a measure of intellectual humility. We wanted a short as possible self-report measure that would be a valid and accurate measure of intellectual humility. And we failed again and again and again. We would write some items, and then we'd do all the statistical tests that are necessary to answer the question, is this a valid and reliable measure of intellectual humility? And the data kept coming back, no, this stinks. You're wrong. You're going down the wrong path. We'd throw it away and write new items and collect new data and analyze again and throw those items away and analyze the data and throw it away again. It took a year. And when I show you how simple the final scale is, which works beautifully, you're going to say, what is wrong with you? I mean, how did it take you a year to come up with such a simple little scale? Well, it just took a long time until we had something that really worked. So here's the measure that most of the studies I'm going to talk about is based on. It's just 6 items where people rate themselves on a 1 to 5 scale to indicate how true is each of these characteristics. So you can think about how you would answer these. I question my own opinions, positions, and viewpoints because they could be wrong. I reconsider my opinions when presented with new evidence. I recognize the value in opinions that are different from my own. I accept that my beliefs and attitudes may be wrong. And that's the key item. That's the item around which everything else centers. And that's a really good conceptualization of intellectual humility. In the face of conflicting evidence, I am open to changing my opinions. I like finding out new information that differs from what I already think is true. 6 simple items. People rate themselves on a 5-point scale. We sum up their scores, and that's their measure of intellectual humility. And the items work remarkably well to measure this, as you'll see. The scores relate to things the way they should. Took a year to get there, but we finally did. And then we could move on with the more interesting aspects of intellectual humility. Let me just give you a picture of what an intellectually humble person is like. Compared to people low in intellectual humility, people high in intellectual humility enjoy thinking more. Now, you may have never thought about the fact that people differ in how much they enjoy thinking. So some people like just thinking about existential issues for which there are no answers. They like trivial pursuit games. They like just pondering things and having discussions with people about philosophical ideas that don't really matter. They like that. Other people say, well, that's just stupid. That's just a waste of time. What are you thinking about all that crazy stuff for? Intellectually humble people enjoy thinking. They're higher in curiosity. You get the sense looking at the data that they want to understand how the world works. They think it's fun to learn about things. They want to have as much information as possible. But they also are curious because they want to understand things. They don't want to be wrong. They want to have the right information. And that's part of the key to intellectual humility. Part of intellectual humility is I don't want to be wrong, so I'm going to question myself from time to time. And that shows up in their approach to curiosity. People higher in intellectual humility have a higher tolerance for ambiguity. Now, none of us like ambiguity. We would all like things to be certain and clear and non-ambiguous. But different ones of us tolerate ambiguity better than some people do. Some people can handle uncertainty in their life and living with doubt and shades of gray. And other people don't. They want the answers now and they're going to stick with them and they want to be certain. It's a little hard to be high in intellectual humility if you don't tolerate ambiguity well. Because being intellectually humble means that there's a little ambiguity in the certainty of your beliefs. Yes, I believe these things about the world. Here are my attitudes. Here's my beliefs about all kinds of important things. But yet, if you're intellectually humble, there's this little thing in the back of your mind that says, yeah, this is what you think, but it's possible you're wrong. And that creates ambiguity that some people just can't deal with. People high in intellectual humility are more open, not just to ideas that may be different from what they believe, but even to experiences, new experiences they haven't tried. So if somebody offers you some really weird food that just seems disgusting, will you try it? People higher in intellectual humility will. If somebody says, hey, here, try this boiled cow eyeball. You go, oh, no, a cow eyeball? Intellectually humble people are more likely to try it. Why? Because they think to themselves, oh, that's disgusting. That's probably going to be terrible. But then the other little voice in their brain says, yeah, but you may be wrong about that. How do you know? You don't know whether cow eyeballs are disgusting. Give it a try. So they're willing to try things even if they think they won't like them. And not surprisingly, they are less dogmatic. They're less insistent they're right. And in moral domains, they're less self-righteous. Yeah, they believe what they believe. They might have very strong moral convictions of one kind or another. But because they hold out some possibility that they may be wrong, they don't lord it over other people as much. They're not as self-righteous. So that kind of gives you a picture of sort of how highly intellectual humility people walk through the world. When we started this project, there were some members of the team who were really interested in intellectual humility, politics, and religion. And some of them assumed that religious people, highly religious people, and political conservatives were going to be less intellectually humble than less religious people and political liberals. And you can sort of see in a stereotypic way why people might think that. But in fact, there was no relationship at all in 3 different data sets between intellectual humility and religiosity, how important religion is to people. No relationship between people's beliefs about whether religion is a good or a bad thing or in the world, and intellectual humility. It's just not there. And when you really think about it, I'm not quite sure why they assume that religious people are going to be lower in intellectual humility. Because let's take the opposite of a religious person. Let's take the atheist. Most atheists are not particularly intellectually humble about their atheism. They believe that's the answer, and they're very reluctant to consider the possibility that atheism is the right answer. So you can have religious and non-religious people who are intellectually humble, and you can have religious and non-religious people who are intellectually arrogant and very low in intellectual humility. What we do find is that lower intellectual humility is correlated with the belief that one's views about religion, whatever they might be, pro or con or indifferent, are correct, which makes sense, right? I mean, people who score lower in intellectual humility go through life believing that what they think is true, and that applies as well to religion. What's interesting here is that there's nothing on that scale I showed you, those 6 items, that make any reference to religion. But we're getting a pretty sizable correlation, negative 0.48 here, between a general approach to intellectual humility that covers everything and intellectual humility with respect to your religious views, whatever those views might happen to be. So it shows there's both a general trait going on here and a more specific, domain-specific intellectual humility when it comes to religion. In terms of politics, we also did not find any difference. I mean, this is the most non-significant finding I think I've ever seen in 40 years. I mean, the means were the same between Democrats, Republicans, and independents in 2 different samples. It isn't there. You can have intellectually arrogant and intellectually humble Democrats, Republicans, and independents. What we do find when it comes to politics, though, is that people with more extreme views in either a conservative or liberal direction are less intellectually humble than people in the middle. Now, I've had some people, when they hear that finding, say, well, that only makes sense. Yeah, if you're more extreme, you're going to be more certain you're right. And I don't know that it's that logical. You could imagine moderates that moderates could be less intellectually humble because they believe that a moderate view is more likely to be right than views on the extremes. That if I'm in the middle, I've got this nuanced view that pulls together the conservative and liberal views, and I put it all together, and this is what the answer is. So the curve could look like this, that I am more certain in my beliefs when I'm moderate. Benjamin Franklin's a good example. He is reputed to have described himself as an extreme moderate. And what he meant by that is he was so convinced that moderate views were always going to be superior in politics to views on either extreme, because they took more things into account and they were more nuanced and they dealt with the shades of gray of life. That's not how it turns out, though. It turns out that people on the extremes are more certain. And you can see that here. Don't try to interpret this. This was a study where we asked about people's attitudes about 9 politically charged topics: healthcare, illegal immigration, abortion, should the federal government help the needy, voter identification laws, 9 different things. We asked people to rate their attitude, conservative or liberal, on a 5-point scale, and tell us how certain they were that their view was correct. From, well, this is my view, but it may be no more correct than anybody else's view, up to, this is the only correct view. This is the only possible way people should think about this. And what you see here is for each of these 9 attitudes, in every case, the people on the extremes, whether it's a liberal extreme or a conservative extreme, were more convinced their views were correct than the people in the middle. Interestingly, liberals and conservatives differed on the issues they were least intellectually humble about. Like for liberals, those 2 lines there at the top, the green one and the purple one, liberals are most convinced that their views about abortion and about the use of torture are correct. And the conservatives were most convinced that their views about healthcare and illegal immigration were correct. But the extremes, in every case, you have a curvilinear relationship here where people on the extremes were least intellectually humble. I think part of the reason for this, I'm getting a photo.
Annette, could you please mute yourself?
I am currently trying to figure out how to get the laptop to mute.
That's that's okay. Maybe you could try going out and coming back in. For some reason, it won't let me mute you. I don't know why. I'm sorry.
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 I think people in the middle here are least convinced of the correctness of their views because the people in the middle with, it says neutral, I probably should say moderate. I think they realize the complexity of the issues, that most issues are not just black and white, clear cut, and that all the evidence goes in one direction. And I think the people in the middle are weighing so many different things that they recognize there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of mush in these attitudes. And so I think that they're less convinced they're correct because they see the complexities in it, would be my interpretation of that. So yeah, I mean, intellectual humility is related both to religious views and to political views, but not in the way that I think a lot of people would have assumed. It doesn't fall out in terms of groups of people. It falls out in terms of people with more extreme views, both in religion and in politics, tend to overall, not just in those areas, but overall, be less intellectually humble. So as we began to get into this, one thing we were interested in is whether people low and high in intellectual humility evaluate evidence differently. Because what we were thinking is that if you're really low in intellectual humility and somebody presents you with evidence against what you believe, you don't even need to listen to it. You really don't. If you're certain you're right, why would you even waste your time listening to evidence? So that would suggest that people low in intellectual humility may not evaluate evidence as carefully and as thoroughly as people high in intellectual humility, who are always maintaining the idea that, well, I might be wrong, so I need to hear whatever new evidence comes in. So to study this, we wanted to use an attitude topic that's not one of those hot button things like religion or politics, but a topic that people would have an attitude about. And we wanted to ask the question of whether people high in intellectual humility evaluate the quality of arguments and evidence more carefully. And we chose to look at attitudes toward dental flossing, because it's something that about half the people in the country floss and think it's good, and about half don't floss and just say, well, what's the big deal? It's not they say it's bad, they just say, I just don't think this is important. What we did is that we wrote two different articles. These were prepared so they looked like they were articles from a magazine, like from Family Circle or Women's Day or something. One-page article arguing that you ought to floss. But we had two versions of each of these articles. Participants read an essay, an article. It was either based on strong evidence-based arguments from dental experts or weak anecdotal arguments from ordinary people. So if you read the article that said you should floss that was evidence-based, it quoted some dental researchers and dentists and the head of some dental society. It presented data. It gave very good reasons why you should floss in terms of protecting your gums and preventing tooth decay. Good evidence, good arguments. The weak argument article, the experts were people like the director of the local YMCA. Perfectly nice guy, I'm sure, but he's not a dental expert. And the arguments for why you should floss weren't based on things like preventing gum disease. It was like, you should floss because it makes your mouth feel good. So it's not that they weren't arguments, they were just weaker arguments. So imagine reading an article and you either got a strong version or a weak version of the evidence. And then we had participants rate the essay and the evidence. Now, the important people here are the non-flossers. Because if you floss and somebody gives you an article to read that says you should floss, you know, okay, and you read it, but you're not really processing the evidence because you already floss. It's not really very relevant to you. So that's not going to change your attitude. So let's look at the non-flossers. Among the people who said they didn't floss, we asked them this before they did the study. People high in intellectual humility rated strong arguments as better than weak arguments. And you're probably thinking, well, sure, why wouldn't they rate strong arguments as better than weak arguments? They were. Yeah, but the surprising thing was that our participants who were low in intellectual humility rated the strength of the two essays equally, which suggests that they didn't even think deeply enough about the article to tell strong from weak arguments. And I want to show you a graph of these results because they really were kind of remarkable. So across the x-axis at the bottom here, you've got intellectual humility from low, standard deviation below the mean, to high, standard deviation above the mean. They're rating the quality of the evidence in the article. And you can see at the low end, low intellectually humble people didn't distinguish. In fact, those two means are not statistically significant. Many of you have had statistics classes. You know, you can have averages in a study that look like they're different, but it's so small, they're not really. Those means are not different. Another way to say that is participants low in intellectual humility rated the strong and weak arguments as equally strong. Participants high in intellectual humility, though, rated them significantly differently. And you can see people high in intellectual humility rated the strong arguments stronger and the weak arguments weaker. Why? They were paying more attention to the evidence. They wanted to get it right because they know that whatever they happen to believe might in fact not be correct. We also gave everybody 8 reasons why people should floss. We did that. Participants high in intellectual humility showed a larger difference in ratings of the strong versus weak reasons than participants low in intellectual humility. So even just looking at a list of arguments, people higher in intellectual humility seem to process them more thoroughly, to think about them more. So it looks like people high in intellectual humility attend more to the evidentiary basis of other people's claims and presumably their own beliefs. What that means is it's easier to change their attitudes with good evidence. They will listen and process the evidence and make sure their beliefs are right because, again, they always entertain the possibility that they might be wrong. People low in intellectual humility don't seem to pay much attention to the quality of evidence as much because they just think, I already know the answer to this. I don't need to think about it anymore. Another question that came up is how do people low and high in intellectual humility respond to people with different viewpoints than they do? I mentioned earlier on, we had the suspicion that people lower in intellectual humility were more likely to derogate people who disagreed with them because they're wrong. How do I know they're wrong? Because I'm right. And in fact, I won't describe the study in detail, but people lower in intellectual humility derogated people who disagreed with them more strongly. They read an essay by someone, and it was against the participants' attitudes. And they derogated the person more. The troubling thing is they didn't just say, I am more convinced this person is wrong. They didn't just rate them as more incorrect, but they also rated them as less competent, less likable, and less ethical, which is sort of disturbing. It's one thing to say, well, I think you're wrong about this. It's another thing to say, I think you're wrong about this, and you're stupid and mean and dishonest. But that's essentially what the participants low in intellectual humility did. Another way to say this is that people higher in intellectual humility seem to be better at separating the message from the messenger. Yeah, I disagree with you. I really disagree with you. I think you're wrong. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. So there's no reason to beat you up over your beliefs because I am not always completely certain that my viewpoint is correct. Now, let me mention that every one of us has these, I think of them as sort of red line attitudes, things we will not cross. I don't care how intellectually humble you or I may be. There's lines we aren't going to cross, that we're going to believe we are completely right on certain things, and we are going to derogate other people who don't agree with that, particularly things with moral overtones. Okay. We all believe that child sexual abuse is wrong. And somebody who disagrees with that, I am sure, we're not going to change our view. We're not going to say, I think child sexual abuse is wrong, but I could be wrong about that. I mean, that would just be whacked, right? That'd be crazy. And we would certainly derogate a person who disagreed with us on that topic. Somebody who says, well, no, I don't think it's that bad. No, that's crazy. So my point is that even highly intellectually humble people have lines that they draw that they will not cross because it's their basic moral principles. So I want to make it clear, I realized over time that sometimes when I talk about this, people think an intellectually humble person just caves into anything somehow. Oh, hey, I don't know what I think about anything. Well, my deepest held beliefs are up for grabs. And that's not the case. I mean, all of us have those red lines, and intellectually humble people do too. Did another study to look at people's reactions to those who changed their minds. And we were thinking here about politicians who changed their position, the times in which they're accused of flip-flopping to get votes. And we wanted to know how people high and low in intellectual humility respond to politicians who change their minds. And our thinking was that highly intellectually humble people ought to be more accepting of that, because they think, well, if I got new evidence, I'd change my mind. So maybe that's what the politician is doing. So we had participants read a scenario about a politician who changed his view on an issue. We didn't tell them what the issue was. We didn't tell participants how he changed it. We just said, there's a politician who, since he ran for office last time, changed his attitude about something. His opponent in the election says he's flip-flopping for votes, but the politician says, no, I've just learned more about this. I realized I was wrong earlier. And then we asked participants, would you vote for this guy who changed his view? Was he flip-flopping? People who were higher in intellectual humility were more accepting of the politician who changed his position than those who were low. And again, I think they're sort of projecting there. They're thinking, well, if I found out something new, I might change my mind. Students sometimes wonder where we get ideas for our studies. The way your teachers talk about in class, it's, well, you read journal articles. You see places where there are holes in the literature, or things where there's disagreements, or you have questions about a study that was done. And that's true. That's where we get some of our ideas. But sometimes we get them in some pretty mundane kinds of places. The idea for this last study I want to talk about, I got in a gift shop, in a card store, when I saw this little card for sale. She says, I married Mr. Right. I just didn't know his first name was Always. And a light bulb went off. I thought, yeah, okay, intellectual humility in relationships. What are the relational implications of having a partner who is low or high in intellectual humility? The implications of living with somebody who thinks he's always right. That can't be good for relationships. Let's study it. So we did a study where we got 74 heterosexual couples, wide range of ages. They'd been in their relationships 6 months to 25 years. These were not college students. We brought in both members of each couple. We separated them, sent them to different rooms, measured each of their intellectual humility, and then had them answer questions about their partner and about the relationship. Now, having both people in a relationship allows us to look at the effects of intellectual humility on each individual, first of all. We can ask the question, how does the man's intellectual humility affect his reactions to the relationship and the partner and how he argues about things? How does the woman's intellectual humility affect her ratings of the relationship with her partner and how she does things? But for us, the more interesting question was that we could look at the effects of one person's intellectual humility on the other person's reactions to the relationship. How does the man's intellectual humility affect his partner's experience in the relationship? And how does her intellectual humility, or lack of it, affect his experience? We have lots of data here. I'm just going to run through about 3 or 4 particular findings. Oh, before I do that, though, people sometimes ask whether there's any relationship between partner scores. On a lot of characteristics, we have what the evolutionary psychologists call assortative mating. And what that means is there's similarity between the characteristics of 2 people in a relationship. Sometimes birds of a feather flock together. So very often we'll have a very extroverted person is likely to get into a relationship with an extroverted person. And introverts tend to pair up with people who are somewhat more introverted. That works out better. Does that happen with intellectual humility? Do people low in intellectual humility gravitate to other low, intellectually humble people and vice versa? And the answer is no. I mean, just there's no relationship. The correlation between the men's and the women's intellectual humility was 0. That's nice for research purposes, right? Because that means that we've got 2 independent things going on here that aren't really related to each other. Each person is bringing whatever level of intellectual humility they might have to the relationship, but it's unrelated, on average, to the partner's level of intellectual humility. So what did we find? We administered a measure of relationship satisfaction, standard 5-item measure that's widely used in relationship research. And it showed that men's satisfaction with the relationship was predicted by their own intellectual humility. Men who were higher in intellectual humility said they were more satisfied with their relationship. Women's satisfaction with the relationship was predicted by her male partner's intellectual humility. Women whose partner was higher in intellectual humility said that they were more satisfied with the relationship than women whose partner was lower in intellectual humility. But interestingly, the women's level of intellectual humility wasn't related to her reactions or to his reactions, only the man's. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. We asked them, overall, how well did you get along as a couple? Again, men's ratings were predicted by their own humility. Higher intellectually humble men said they got along better. And their female partners agreed. Women's ratings of how long they got along were related to her partner's intellectual humility. The more intellectually humble he was, the better the women said they got along. Again, the women's intellectual humility didn't do anything. And we found that again and again and again, a big gender difference. Across many measures, men's intellectual humility, or lack of it, appears to play a bigger role in both his and her ratings of relationship quality than women's intellectual humility, which really didn't do very much. We're not quite sure why this is, but looking at a lot of the different ratings about the relationships, it looks like men with low intellectual humility have a particularly toxic, antagonistic way of dealing with disagreements. The women low in intellectual humility apparently don't do that. There's some socialization difference, I think, where men are socialized to deal with disagreements differently than women are. And men low in intellectual humility really, that difference really explodes, where they argue and disagree with each other and with their partners in very toxic ways. So, any of you women who are currently aren't in a relationship and you're hoping to get in one, maybe you want to take the questionnaire with you, and as you go around and meet men, before things get too deep, if you're a heterosexual woman, you want to make sure you're test this guy out, because you don't want a man who's low in intellectual humility. Something else we found is that couples in which both partners scored low in intellectual humility were particularly troubled relationships. They had more arguments, lower satisfaction, more maladaptive ways of arguing, like slamming doors and throwing things and calling each other names. it sometimes takes only one intellectually humble intellectually humble person to help save a relationship, to not overreact when these kinds of things happen. And let me just show you one plot of data. This is an item where we asked them, how often when you guys are arguing, does your partner act like they're 100% right? And these are women's ratings. How often does your partner act as if he's 100% right when you have an argument? And this is what I want to point out here. The women who themselves are low in intellectual humility and their male partner is low in intellectual humility were significantly more likely to say the guy always acts like he's right. But what's interesting about that finding, I mean, there's two reasons why these men are acting like they're right. One is they're low in intellectual humility, so they think they're right. But the other is they're in a relationship with a partner who's also low in intellectual humility, who appears to push their buttons and make them act even more like they're right. Because if you follow that line down there from that circled point, men low in intellectual humility with a female partner who was high in intellectual humility did not show that effect. They didn't act like they were always right. So it's an interactive effect of his intellectual humility or lack of it, and her intellectual humility or lack of it. And what's interesting is these women, I'm sure, think, well, my partner here is just an idiot. He acts like he's always right, without realizing the degree to which they're contributing to that. And we found several instances of this, where people didn't seem to be aware that their intellectual humility was affecting their partner. High intellectually humble women rated their partners as more agreeable and less selfish. Were they really? No evidence in our data that these men were inherently more agreeable or less selfish, but they acted that way because they were in a relationship with a high intellectually humble woman. Had she been low in intellectual humility, she'd have pushed a bunch of buttons that made him more disagreeable and more selfish. Low intellectually humble men rated their partners as more stubborn and less flexible. Were they? Not that we could see. But those low intellectually humble men were pushing buttons that made their partners more stubborn and less flexible. And I really like this one. When the man was high in intellectual humility, both members of the couple rated each other as more intelligent and well-informed. So she's looking at him. He's high in intellectual humility. Well, he comes out as an intelligent, well-informed, reasonable guy. That makes sense. But what's interesting is the converse. If the man is low in intellectual humility, he's more likely to think his partner is stupid and poorly informed. Why? Because she disagrees with him. She's stupid. I mean, that's the reasoning, I think, of a low intellectually humble man is if you disagree with me, you're stupid and not very well informed. And more generally, there's a lot of things in our relationships where we look at our partner's behavior and we attribute it to our partner. He or she is this way or that way. And that's partly true. Their personalities are playing out, but we are creating some of the things that we're seeing. And it's clear in this study that that was the case with our participants in terms of intellectual humility. Let me wrap up real quickly. There's nothing in this life, I don't think, that's 100% good. I think in general, it's better to be high than low in intellectual humility. But there probably are some downsides. We don't have research on this, but let me just mention three that people have mentioned to me. If my slides will advance, which they won't. There we go. Slower decisions, not just slower decisions, but slower PowerPoint things coming up. The idea is this. If I am less convinced that my beliefs are correct, or if I'm always checking myself to see if I'm right, does that lead me to make slower decisions? I always keep checking. I want to make sure, oh, I think it's this, but maybe it's not this. Oh, I got to think about it. Where somebody low in intellectual humility can make a decision really quickly. What's the right decision? Well, whatever I think it is the right decision. So it could be, it'd be an easy study to do to see if intellectually humble people make decisions less quickly. Of course, the flip side is maybe it's better to make a slower decision and get it right than faster decisions and get it wrong. Does intellectual humility lead people to be reluctant to take a stand? Yes, I believe in this thing. Maybe I should go protest, or maybe I should donate money or my time, but maybe my views aren't quite right on this. I could be wrong. I don't think it interferes with taking a stand to be intellectually humble. Intellectually humble people are not uncertain. I want to make that clear. It's not that they go, well, I don't know what to think here. I don't know whether I think this or I think that. I don't know what to do. They're not paralyzed by doubt. They believe firmly in what they believe. They have to get along in life. You have to decide what you think and then move on it. So they believe what they believe and they're certain, but there's that little voice again who says, okay, act on it as if it's real, as if you're correct. But keep in mind that you might, in fact, be wrong. So I don't think this is true, but it needs to be tested. And finally, people have suggested to me that maybe being intellectually humble conveys an image of uncertainty and wishy-washy, like you never quite know what you're doing or whether you're doing the right thing. Again, I don't get that sense. Intellectually humble people have strong, firm beliefs. They just entertain the possibility they might be wrong. Now, if you go through life and you continually, every time you say something, you go, oh, but I could be wrong about that. Yeah, you might look uncertain and wishy-washy, but that's not really what intellectual humility is. So these things I think need to be studied. We need to know if there are downsides that we can sort of fight against. Let me conclude with a quotation, not by a psychologist, but by science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, who said, people who think they know everything are a great annoyance to those of us who do. Thanks for showing up and inviting me. And I guess, Ashley, we may have a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Leary. We really appreciate it. That was a wonderful talk. I'm sure we do have some questions. So what we're going to do is if you have a question, I'm going to have you just put it in the chat box, or maybe just put your name in the chat box and then you can unmute yourself and ask it however you want to do it. You can also put the question, I'll read it, whatever's better for you. And then if you don't have access to the chat because you're on your phone, I'll give y'all some time after I get through the chat questions to see if you guys have anything to add. So, all right. So first, Dr. Bush says, this was such an interesting talk. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks again for taking the time to come and present to UNCP. Oh, that's nice, Dr. Bush. So no question there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice job. Another thank you, Dr. Leary. Okay, so Professor Sneed says connections between this and the phenomenon known as mansplaining.
Oh, what a great question. I have not thought of that. Oh,
I like this question.
I think that's a great question. And I assume the hypothesis you have is that men lower in intellectual humility are going to be particularly prone to mansplaining. I guess I assume is a hypothesis. I think that's
what I was thinking along the way. Yes.
What a great idea. That's because that's just a hot topic right now. That's great.
You must study on this.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, have there been cross-cultural studies of this construct?
Not specifically of this construct. There have been cross-cultural studies of sort of open and closed-mindedness more generally, because cultures differ in the degree to which you ought to be certain about things. It's a weird thing. How much does a culture value people being certain as opposed to being open to various possibilities? So there are cultural differences, but people have not looked at it specifically with intellectual humility the way that we've studied. But that's a good question too. I like that.
I would also, thank you, Nicole, for that question. I would also think that, just because the topic's so new, maybe we'll see some cross-cultural research in the future, but not anything yet. Okay, sorry. Dr. Bush has a question for us about the relationship study. So Dr. Bush, take it away.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had looked at if they rated how much intellectual humility their partner had. So, and if they were accurate, like how accurate are people's judgments? If somebody else rates your humility, for instance, if they rated mine and I rated mine, how closely would those scores match up? Or did you not look at that?
No, we looked at it in a couple of ways. we didn't want to give away exactly what we were studying. So we waited till toward the end of the questionnaire and we gave them our definition of intellectual humility and said, rate your partner on this. And once people see that, as you might expect, yeah, people, it's sort of in the same level of accuracy as most visible characteristics when partners rate each other. Like when you have people rate the big five and things in their partners, that you get correlations in the 0.4, 0.5 range. And as I recall, that's about what we got there. So people can detect, once you mention it, they go, oh yeah, either he or she, I said he there, he or she, does consider the possibility that it's wrong or doesn't. So yeah, people pick up on that to some extent. We also asked very much more specific questions about behaviors that would be manifestations of low and high intellectual humility. And clearly, the partner scores related very strongly to what people were reporting about how their partner behaved.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Bush, and thank you for responding, Dr. Leary. Okay, so we have a couple of questions from Mary and Madison, maybe others, that are asking about how you think this would translate with same-sex couples. So I don't know if you guys have talked about that in the lab, but just a few comments would be good.
Yeah, we did talk about that. When we did that study, we didn't screen just for heterosexual couples. We just took whatever couples came, and we did have 2 same-sex couples. That's obviously too small of a sample to do anything with statistically, so we just simply removed them for purposes of analysis. It needs to be studied because it's a really interesting question. If there are gender differences, socialized gender differences in dealing with disagreements and with intellectual certainty, it would be fascinating to be able to take a look at how that plays out in same-sex couples. So much of the relationships research on same-sex couples is brand new. I mean, it's just not very much. What's interesting is most of the time the patterns look pretty much the same. That if you look at the couples may differ, even though they're of the same sex, in their intellectual humility, and I think the same patterns would play out in terms of the detrimental effects of having low intellectual humility. But then gender doesn't enter in with an amplifying effect that you find in the study we had for men. That's a great question. No, it needs to be done, absolutely. We need to be replicating a lot of our relationships for search using same-sex couples.
Very good. Thank you so much. Okay, so so if we have a couple that has some of these issues, so struggling with like partners who are really low in intellectual humility, what are some potential solutions to help rectify these issues? I think we need to know how to help ourselves here.
Yeah.
Don't shake your head.
Well, that's a very important question. I'm shaking my head just simply because, I'm not a clinical psychologist or a family counselor. These things I always hate to give applied recommendations to people because I feel like I'm just making them up, and that any one of you could come up with as good a solutions as I can. I think it always helps when there are relationship problems to understand the basis of them. And I think if this kind of thing arises in a relationship, then I think simply understanding I have a partner who has this way of looking at the world. Maybe because they have a low tolerance for ambiguity, maybe because they're just don't enjoy thinking about things and they want to come to decisions and believe they're right and not have to ponder questions more deeply because they think they might be wrong. I think I don't want to say it normalizes low intellectual humility, but sometimes we make such negative attributions that our partner who acts this way is mean or inconsiderate or disregarding of us, which is partly true. But I think maybe the first step is that just thinking about it in terms of this is someone who has trouble recognizing in their own mind that they may be wrong about things. And when you look at it that way, then it's just sort of a cognitive thing. It's a bias, and it's not something pathological or really troubling. Maybe you can work with it a little bit better when you depersonalize it, and it's not about me. It's about the fact that you have trouble dealing with uncertainty in your beliefs. Other than that, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to. I feel like a fraud. I feel like an imposter if I answer questions.
No, that's more research for all of us to do, figure out how to fix it. Okay. So are people with certain personality disorders or characteristics, I'll say, more prone to be like low intellectual humility?
If you're just talking about general personality, The only one of the big five personality characteristics that's gotten so much attention that correlates really highly is openness, which you would expect. Openness as a personality characteristic is broader than openness about the fact that your beliefs may be wrong. But certainly there are fundamental personality things: tolerance for ambiguity, need for cognition, dogmatism.
Well,
Those are probably the big four.
Jalen specifically mentioned narcissism.
Narcissism?
Yeah.
The biggest surprise of everything we've collected is that narcissism per se was very weakly related to low intellectual humility. And we dug into that to try to figure out why, because I didn't believe it. You would think that narcissists on average would be less intellectually humble. And they are. It's just not as big effect. I thought it would be a whopping effect. I was almost afraid that low intellectual humility was narcissism. I think it's because a narcissist is grandiose about themselves as a person, their specialness, their special qualities, and how admirable they are. And only a very small part of that, and sometimes none of that, is related to their beliefs in the truth of their beliefs and attitudes. So I think it's a really fine distinction, but it's the only way in looking at our data that I can explain why narcissism isn't as related as I would have thought that it was, because everybody would have assumed that, and it's just not there. It's the difference between thinking I'm special and wonderful and thinking that my beliefs are special and wonderful. And yeah, there's a little relationship, but it's not as big as I thought.
Thanks. That was a good question, Jalen. I thought the same thing.
It was.
Okay, so a couple of correlation questions of intellectual humility. Is it related to IQ or intelligence, education level, and age? Okay, so IQ or, intelligence, education level, and age.
Intelligence, I don't know. Education is a really interesting thing. We have a data set in which the hint is that as you become more educated, you may become more intellectually humble about your general knowledge. When you go to college, you realize there's a whole lot more I don't know than I thought that I didn't know. So you really realize the expansiveness of your ignorance. So you become more intellectually humble about your general knowledge while you become less intellectually humble about your area of expertise. Now, in some sense, that makes sense. If I learn a lot more about psychology than most of the other people, because they didn't major in psychology, then I sort of have a right to think that my beliefs about psychology are probably more correct than theirs. But it's a double whammy. Experts are more intellectually humble about their general ignorance about a lot of things, but less intellectually humble about their area of expertise. Intellectual humility declines slightly with age. It's a very small correlation in the 0.15, 0.2 range. People, as they get older, they just begin to accumulate plenty of instances in which they were wrong, where they were convinced about something and then they find out that they were wrong. And I think that wears on you. So by the time you're my age, you realize, well, now I got a lot bigger collection of times I was wrong when I thought I was right than most of you. So it beats intellectual arrogance out of you as you get older.
So you become more intellectually humble as you get older?
Just slightly. Again, it's a really small correlation with age. We do have one sample with enough ages to test that, but it's a very weak decline. And I think it just, again, has to do with I have a lot more experience being wrong.
Okay. Dr. Boziowski said she's wondering whether we know if people who are low in intellectual humility don't have the critical thinking skills to understand good versus bad evidence, or whether it's a refusal to consider it. So is it the critical thinking skills or is it a refusal to consider it? And then she asked another question about expertise, which I think you already answered.
Okay. We don't know the answer. I think the assumption is that they simply don't stop to think about the fact that their beliefs may be incorrect. If you put them in a situation, would they have equally good critical thinking skills if they were somehow forced to use them? My hunch is yes. And maybe there's some small correlation there that maybe people are low in intellectual humility because they just don't figure things out, and so they think they're more correct than they are. And that's possible. But I think most of it is they just don't think about it. If they did think about it, I think they'd probably do basically okay. It's an open question, though. I don't know if that answer I just gave is right. And Janet, you've got the skills in your lab to be able to study that better than I do. That'd be great.
Yeah, and thank you, Dr. Boziowski, for joining us with the lab. Okay, so there are, let's see, similar characteristics to the need for cognition. So, like high curiosity, differences in persuasive information. So, do you think there'd be a correlation between intellectual humility and the need for cognition?
Yes, there is. About 0.3 something.
Nice. Okay, where can we find the scale if we want to use it or take it?
The article in which the scale is published is in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. It's a 2017 publication. I don't know if it may be on my website. I stick most of my scales that I've used for things on my website, and it's there. You just pull it down and use it. But if anybody's interested, email me and tell me you saw this, and I'll just send you a copy of the whole article, scale and all, with the details about some of these studies.
Thank you. Do you have time for any more questions? I have a couple more, Mark. If you're,
Until the sun goes down right out here, and then I don't have any light anymore.
Okay, well, so Jalen had a question. I asked her for a little more clarification. So Jalen, you might have to chime in here. But she said, are individuals more likely to change their views when they're on either side of the spectrum, or do they typically stay the same throughout their life based upon which side of the spectrum they're on? So how are you interpreting that, Dr. Leary?
I'm not sure what spectrum she's
Okay, we
referring
might
to.
need more clarification. Jalen, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Okay, yes. Basically, is it easier for people that are on the low end of the spectrum to get to the high end of the spectrum? Does that clarify it better?
Yes. Boy, that's a really good question. I have never considered if you wanted to change. I mean, presumably most people would want to become more intellectually humble. I mean, maybe you could have somebody who says, I'm tired of considering the possibility I might be wrong, and now I want to be set in my ways. So let's imagine we had two people, one who's really low who wants to become high, and one who's high who wants to become low. I don't know the answer to that. That is a really interesting question. There are certainly people who are trying to develop programs to increase intellectual humility. For example, in school, in terms of teaching people to be more open about their mistakes and that sort of thing. There's some suggestion the education system kind of scares people out of intellectual humility. You're supposed to always know the right answer and be confident about it. And maybe that's not the way to train kids. But in terms of your question, I don't know. That's a really good question. Do you have a hunch one way or another? Whoever asked that question?
No, I mean, I was thinking maybe someone that's low would probably want to be higher because maybe they're tired of doubting things. But at the same time, maybe someone that's high could think, okay, maybe I need to go on the lower side because I might not be as right as I think I am. So yeah, I was kind of 50-50 as well.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. That's good.
Okay, so for those of you who don't have, hold on, we got more. What age developmentally do you think a person's level of intellectual humility settles into their person? I like that question. So, at what age is their trait level set?
That's an exceptional question. And I think people change a lot during college, again, as they sort of figure out what they do and do not know, and they learn in various classes how to consider evidence and what you ought to stand up for and what you shouldn't. So I think for people who go to college, I think it's during or after that. But other than that, I don't know. We do have a developmental psychologist listening here, so we can have them chime in. I don't know. It's a really good question. Don't know.
Yeah, I'm not trying to put Dr. Boziowski on the spot, but if she wants, she can certainly say something. Okay, so beyond that, you guys, does anybody who doesn't have access to the chat have, oh, she says no idea, some flexibility in adolescence. So she's chiming in.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any questions from those who don't have access to the chat who want to throw in a question from your phone? Anybody? They're scared to talk. Okay. Okay. I can't think of more. Do you think we can? Oh, yeah, have different levels of intellectual humility in different areas of life. And I know you didn't get into this too much, but yeah.
No, that's a great question. Absolutely. I mean, even the most intellectually humble people might have areas of life and particular topics where they are just completely set in their ways. And you can have some people who are low in intellectual humility generally, who at times will suddenly say, well, hey, I may be wrong about this. So yes, that's where we're talking about domain-specific intellectual humility. I didn't talk about it much. My colleague at Duke, Rick Hoyle, has done more of the work having to do with domain-specific intellectual humility and developed some ways of measuring that. Yeah, well, each of us have some things that we're really hard-headed about. I think about sports fanatics. My older son is a really intellectually humble guy, except he's really opinionated about certain kinds of sports topics, and he's very intellectually arrogant about that for whatever reason.
Did you see any suggestions for books or further reading on intellectual humility?
There's nothing there. There's nothing there. Somebody
Need to go
needs to
write
do
one
that. Yeah, my spare time. Let me just mention, because you mentioned about the developmental sequence, and let me tell you something that I did with my kids long before I studied this, and it wasn't to make them intellectually humble, but I think it kind of did. I realized as a young parent, my kids would have been about, I don't know, 8 and 5, that I fell into that trap, that when I told them to do something and they objected, hey, turn off the TV and go to bed. And they would object. Oh, Dad, it's only 5 more minutes. No, I said to turn it off. I did the standard damn parent thing where I said it, so you got to go do it. And I realized sometimes I walked away from that thinking, that was dumb. It was only 5 minutes. Why didn't I let them stay up and watch the rest of the TV show? So it made me feel like a bad parent. And I realized that they were frustrated. It created some conflict. And so I sat them down and I said, from now on, when I tell you to do something, I will give you the opportunity to make one objection so that I can reconsider what I just said. I said, now, a lot of times I'm the dad, and yeah, no, you really do need to finally go to school today. But Dad, I don't want to go to school. No, you got to go to school today. But at least it shows you that I'll reconsider, because sometimes I work things out that aren't quite right. And that really helped. And they used it judiciously, and I backed down probably a third of the time on things. Well, Dad, didn't you think about this? Oh, okay, well, all right. And I think I did it again, mostly to avoid conflict, not to be intellectually humble, but I think I role modeled sort of a weird kind of intellectual humility that Dad sometimes thinks things that are wrong. And when given the opportunity to reconsider it, he'll take it back. And they're both pretty intellectually humble guys. And I don't know whether it's due to that or not, but I'll just recommend that for those of you who have or someday will have kids. You can avoid a whole lot of hassle if you just sometimes say, well, yeah, let me think about it again.
Yeah, my kids are going to love you for that. Okay, so there have been a couple more. We can cut these off at any time.
I feel bad for you guys. I'm doing fine. Yeah, I'm doing all right. You guys have a lot of other interesting and important things to do.
You think. Okay. What about when parents say, my teenager thinks she knows everything? I might have another comment in here about developmental type stuff, but this lack of intellectual humility in tweens and teens, let's talk about that a little more.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely a developmental procession where I think there's a point at which kids realize they can think for themselves. They just don't realize that what they think is often wrong. Up to a certain age, kids are obviously thinking, but they're not sort of conscious about their thinking and how what they're thinking differs from what other people are thinking. But until you have some experiences realizing that some of the stuff you think is just stupid and wrong and misguided, yeah, well, why not think that you know everything? You haven't had enough experience to realize that you don't. So, yeah, I think that's a very natural stage, and it's just a flare up of low intellectual humility that then gets counteracted by experience. That's a great question. I'd love to have developmental psychologists, take the topic and run with it, because there's a lot of really interesting developmental questions.
Yeah, and so there's some other comments about that in the chat too, if you guys want to check them out. Talking about intellectual humility as a nature or nurture type thing. I mean, comments.
Well, virtually every personality characteristic is a nature and nurture thing. And behavioral genetics research shows that about an equal amount of variability, as you look across people on almost any personality characteristic, extroversion, let's say, you say, oh, these people have a lot of variability here in extroversion. About half of that variability is genetic, it's nature, and about half of it has to do with experience and it's nurture. And I have to assume, just because almost every personality characteristic is that way, that that's true of intellectual humility. If you look at openness, which is that one big personality trait that is related to intellectual humility, it's about half nature, half nurture, half genetic, half experiential. So I assume that both play a role. There are certain things that you inherit, like I think the tolerance for ambiguity, that is a high genetic component. Some people just don't deal with the uncertainty. They're just the way their brain works. And if that's the case, that sets you up to be lower or high in intellectual humility.
Nice, thank you. So, is there a relationship between intellectual humility and like socioeconomic status? I mean, do we know anything? Like, well,
I don't know. We've never had samples that have quite enough variability in socioeconomic status. We've looked at that. We do have some really rough indicators, and there's never a whole lot there, but I've never trusted it because we really don't have much diversity. I don't know. That's a good question.
thank you. Dr. Boziowski would like us to know that her lab's going to get on this from a developmental perspective. So when you start seeing all these intellectual humility articles coming out of UNCG, you're going to be like, that's what she's doing. Okay, so any final things? I think we're good and I can wrap it up. So I want to just let Dr. Morrison have a couple minutes. Her and Dr. Bush are the advisors for Psychi. And so I think they would like to say something.
Hi, Dr. Leary. I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to give this amazing talk. Everyone in Psychi was so excited to hear you talk. They picked you. You were like top on their list of people they wanted to hear. So we really appreciate it. And I've learned so much. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you. And thank you again for being here. It's always a pleasure to see you, even if it's across a computer screen. And hopefully you enjoyed giving a talk like this.
I did. I mean, it is very unusual compared with what I've done for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you turning out and being responsive and hanging out this long. Geez, it's 20 after 6. Don't you guys have lives?
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Really
I appreciate
you tuning in.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.
Thanks again. Bye.
Yay. So Mark, thank you so much.
Is it just you and me now?
No, there's still a bunch.
Still listening? I just want to tell you personally how much I enjoyed that.
You can just go ahead and tell me how awesome I am with all these witnesses. That's fine.
It's amazing. No, amazing.
She is awesome. We love Ashley so much.
Yeah,